Hello, folks. You are evicted. You have what, 72 hours to pay or get out. This is a form of housing insecurity. It can take a number of many forms: homelessness, housing cost burden, residential instability, evictions and other forced moves, living with family or friends to share housing costs like doubling up, overcrowding, living in substandard, poor quality housing, or living in neighborhoods that are unsafe and lack access to transportation, jobs, quality schools, and other critical amenities. So, this is something that I didn't know was something that I experienced really until I got into housing. So, I was a kid, my mom was single and taking care of me herself, and we had money issues. I didn't understand sort of the weight of it until I was an adult. But I remember that we got a few of these notices. If we like paid late, our landlord was sort of harsh. And so at the time I didn't really get it, but I still felt the constraints of money, right? I felt that I was definitely one of those folks that had to tiptoe into mom's room if I had to ask for money for school or something, because usually the response is like, it's that DMV sigh, right? Because it's like she has to put out more money for something. And as a kid, you're sort of like, dang, mom, like I'm just trying to like, go hang out with my friends or go get a meal with them or something like that. And it feels like, why do you have to like be like that if I ask you for a little something? But as an adult, I think I see her perspective. If we're struggling and sort of the threat of eviction is always upon us, then yeah, I can see that like trying to put out extra money for extra things can be a weight, an emotional weight, psychological, lots of stuff, right? And so this is a thing that is a housing issue. And I wouldn't have known that either until I got into housing. But yeah, this homelessness, high cost burden, all of these things are housing issues. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about housing. This is Abundant Housing LA's Housing 101 webinar. We do this every other month, most of the year. But right now, because we want to make sure that a lot of the folks that we're interacting with are able to attend this if they can, we were doing it monthly. So right now, we did it last month, we're doing it this month, we'll do it next month, and the month after that. So I say that just to say that if you find something that you enjoy or learn something new and you're like, oh, I got to tell somebody, let your friends know that there will be another one and bring them. But yeah, thank y'all for being here. This is a little bit of our agenda for today. These are the things that we're going to be running through. This should end with enough time for us to have a Q&A at the end if anyone has questions. But yeah, let's get started. So first, it's important to do a land acknowledgement when we're talking about housing. And I have to say specifically that I did this land acknowledgement based on where I live. I live in the Pico Union neighborhood of Los Angeles. So that's like sort of like south of Westlake, if you know where that is, in like Washington and Hoover, where these at the 101 and the 110 intersect. I'm bad with freeways. I don't drive. So I may have mixed up those numbers, but I'm pretty sure those are the two freeways that intersect near me. That said, Abundant Housing LA recognizes and acknowledges the first people of this ancestral and unceded territory. It belonged to the Tongva Gabrielino people, and the land is now occupied where I live by State Senate District 26 and City Council District 1. We acknowledge and honor Indigenous folks' elders, past and present, and their descendants. We recognize that the Tongva peoples are still here, and we're committed to lifting up their stories, culture, and community. The first peoples of this nation ensured every member of the community had a home. We share a fundamental human responsibility to ensure that as the people who came after, we can say the same. So if you want to look up sort of like most of Los Angeles you'll get the same result. But if you'd like to look up what exactly your area, like what kind of first peoples were there, you can go to native/land.ca. And then if you'd like to learn more about the Gabrielino tribe, you could go to gabrielinotribe.org. So what does Abundant Housing LA do? So we address the upstream causes of the housing crisis and housing shortage and build a movement for structural change so that LA becomes a place of abundant housing. Now, why is abundant housing so important? And I always have to clarify this, that Abundant Housing LA is our org name, right? But abundant housing is a concept also. So why is it important? Well, there's a few reasons, but here are a couple of them. First, more affordable housing. Multifamily apartment buildings are cheaper per unit than single family homes. But even though so many people need a place to live, most of LA is still zoned for housing scarcity through low density suburban sprawl. Another reason why abundant housing is so important is that it helps to address the racial and economic inequality that we experience. White supremacy created exclusionary single family zoning and then sold it to the public as the American dream. And more housing density actually means more diversity and neighbors, which is a good thing. So we seek to achieve abundant housing through advocacy, policy, and education to shift LA culture around housing. And we hope that you'll be a part of this effort. So I am Joshua Gonzalez. I am Abundant Housing LA's education director. I now do this webinar every time we do it. But I have to just also say that I don't do this alone. There was someone who did it before me, and I learned a lot from him. And we have a whole staff and people on our committees that help put this stuff together, do some of the research for us, things like that. So there's a group of us. It takes a village, as it were. So let's start. Residential segregation. You're like, what? Right? Well, that's exactly what some of the policies around housing that we've experienced in Los Angeles and beyond have done. That's the impact. So the first thing, let's talk about covenants. So if you don't know, a lot of houses have a deed, right? So it's sort of a document that belongs to the owner of the home. And on these deeds, there used to be these little parts that said that basically no one who was non-white can live here. There were a couple of exceptions, like if a person who was non-white lived there in sort of a service capacity, then they were allowed to. But otherwise, you weren't allowed to sell to someone who was non-white. No one who is non-white was allowed to live there. And this created already sort of this issue about like people can't really live where they want to. And making sure that people who we don't want to be with us, speaking as someone who maybe enjoyed their restrictive covenant, we don't want people who aren't like us to be able to live here, live in this house or in this neighborhood. And so that is a huge thing. And some of those, it's not legal to do that anymore, to say that someone can't live here because of their race or ethnicity. But you will see that even on this picture, that the one on the left-hand side was for a house that was built in the 50s. And so it's not even that far back. And I'm sure that there are lots of houses that still have this sort of language in their deeds. It's not enforceable. A lot of people ignore it. Some people go out of their way to have it stricken from the deed, if they want to do that. But this is an important thing here. And so it's just, we're looking at how these discriminatory policies that have this negative impact on housing and where people can live and the cost of it, sort of how deep it is. And so it goes all the way into like home ownership, right? You cannot own this home. You cannot live here unless you are white and probably wealthy, right? So that's just one thing. Let's talk about what that means as far as like single family zoning. So what is single family zoning? It's a type of legal classification that restricts the kind of residential housing that can be built on a property. And so under these restrictions, only single family detached homes can be built. So this was first proposed in the early 20th century. It was used as a tool to preserve home values and maintain public health and safety. Zoning advocates argued, for example, that channeling residential development in the neighborhoods of detached single-family houses far removed from shops and offices would be a boon to Americans' health, right? So it's always like, it's not, a lot of these things that we'll talk about today, some of them are outwardly racist, some of them are outwardly and explicitly discriminatory, but some of them are sort of like subtle or like we actually get into a section called, as you saw, called dog whistle racism, where it's sort of like, oh, it's not a pro, it's a health thing. It's a health that we have to have single family housing because it's a health thing, right? And that's sort of just like a veiled way of saying we don't want to be near the urbanized sort of like metropolitan areas that will likely have non-white people and probably not wealthy people. And so some of that was used in some of these neighborhoods that we know now. Back in the day, there were, when cars weren't so prevalent, some of these cities were sort of blocked off by hills, by mountains, things like that. And so you'll see that in some of these like little advertisements that they advertise, oh, there's natural restrictions that, favorable restrictions that create a community of beautiful homes. I think one of these things here actually says that the residents of Eagle Rock are all like, it's only white people. Prices are low, property values will increase. So come on out here. You can drive out here because you're rich enough to have a car, and then you don't have to be in the middle of all of that non-white mess, right? That's kind of the vibe that they had. And so, yeah, they said that the residential districts were spoiled by metropolitan development. So they wanted you to protect your family. And like we talked about on the slide before, it was like, you'll be healthier, right? Single family zones in these other cities that have these, natural mountain restrictions where you have to drive out there to get to them. This is where you're going to be safe as a white wealthy person, right? That's something that we see here. So Eagle Rock, Hollywood Hills, were a couple of those areas, and it's just at that time, which you'll see a lot of, that's the kind of language that was used. It wasn't like weird to say, no, we don't want you to live here, or they maybe thought they were being subtle, but it's like, no, we know what you really mean. But yeah, that's a sort of thing here. So we go from this single family homes and single family zoning, and then we decide where to put that, like I said, sort of excludes folks from being able to live there. So let's talk about redlining and a couple of the things that led up to it. So first, what's on this slide are some of the events that led up to redlining and contribute to the segregation and neighborhoods with minority folks. So the Great Depression led to lots of people defaulting on home loans and losing their homes to foreclosure. And so the government responded to that by creating the National Housing Act in 1934, and with that, the Federal Housing Authority, or FHA. So leaving, what they did is they were like, okay, well, we'll give you a loan, we'll create a better mortgage system. That 30-year mortgage thing that didn't exist before. They were much shorter mortgages, but as people needed more time to be able to pay those off, to be able to gain ownership of their home, they created these low interest, 30-year mortgages. So that's the National Housing Act. And then from that was the Wagner-Steagall Act or Housing Act of 1937, which established the United States Housing Administration, and they built publicly subsidized housing. So the federal government provided funding, but this is a really important piece. The ownership and operation of the housing was left up to the local public housing authority, appointed by local elected officials. So it was sort of like, okay, yeah, here's money, which sounds good, right? Build public housing. Yes, that's good. People need it. People are moving around a lot at that time because of the wars and because of wartime, like factories and things like that. And so that's where you'll see a lot of the increase in population in Los Angeles and across Southern California. And so we needed more housing, right? And so that is just really important, though, that it was all left up. There wasn't anyone to really keep local areas accountable for where they were going to build it, how much, and things like that. But that's all to say that as far as the mortgage situation and giving people loans and things like that, banks created these maps that told, or sorry, excuse me, I should say that the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, not Avengers Hulk, but HOLC, HOLC, it was created in June 1933 by the US Congress. And the purpose was to refinance mortgages in default to prevent foreclosures. And so in 1935, Federal Home Loan Bank Board asked HOLC to look at 239 cities and create residential security maps to indicate the level of security for real estate investments. And this is what banks used to determine, oh, are we going to fund this person so that way they can either buy a home or maintain the home they have, or not, right? And so what this looked like is that in areas that were green lined, and so just take a look at this again before I move on. So you'll notice where there are green areas, there's blue, there's red, and there's yellow, right? So in the green areas, these are like the good areas. This is the tip-top place to live, right? So it's ethnically homogenous, which you can read as white, US born, upper middle class neighborhood where professional men lived. There's also blue line, which is still desirable, established, most or nearly all white US born neighborhood with a low chance of having an immigrant or person of color moving in. And so these are like the most desirable areas at the time. And you'll notice that some of the language they use is now really offensive, but it was just kind of normal back in the day. But you'll see that like it's, there's no foreign families, there's no different nationalities, no Negroes, gross. But it's, for business and professional men, movie stars, things like that. But then you have this redlining description, and just before we talk about that, so yellow, which is not as undesirable as the redlining, are like declining neighborhoods. So banks are still not going to give to folks that are in the yellow lined neighborhoods. But this is the area description of redlining. It's like white collar workers, which is something also to include, is that it's not just non-white people, it's actually poor people as well. I mean, I think that, we can have an argument about how much worse off non-white folks are, because it's true. If you look at the sort of like overrepresentation of Black people in homelessness, you can see how that impacted them. But still, at the time, it was any non-white people and people who were not wealthy. And so it was people who worked in movie and radio, service workers, artisans, things like that. And the way that they described the area is this very like, well, there's 15% foreign families, there's a few percent, whatever that means, of Negroes, there's Orientals and Mexicans, just bad. And you'll see that in some of this stuff, it goes more into that. It talks about how, let's see, what is it? Maintenance is generally of poor quality and population and extremely heterogeneous and includes many subversive racial and social low grade and poor character, all these kinds of things. So it's basically just saying that anywhere where there is multifamily housing and non-white and non-wealthy people is undesirable, and we're not going to give any loans or mortgages or any investment in those areas. What's the next thing? So Article 34, this is an interesting one. I continue to learn things about Article 34. And so Article 34 was passed after a legal dispute over a proposed federally funded public housing project in the city of Eureka. Local residents opposed the project and attempted to stop it by passing a referendum. However, the California Supreme Court found in favor of the city, reasoning that a referendum can only apply to a legislative act, and that the city public housing authority's application for federal money was an administrative act. In the wake of that defeat, public housing opponents changed tactics and organized a campaign to amend the California Constitution, align with the real estate industry to run a successful campaign that stoked racist fears about integration and socialism. And so basically, this is to say that you cannot build public housing here without a vote by local stakeholders. And so what you see on the screen now is a picture of, and Lauren, I see your hand is up. Just give me questions to chat or either one. Q&A or chat, either one works. And we'll get to those toward the end of the session. Thank you for asking. Yes, if y'all have questions, please feel free to put them Q&A or chat. I will look at both. And I'll let you know when we start that Q&A part of this webinar. So yeah, this was a pamphlet for Proposition 10, which is what sort of started the process of Article 34. And you see that they basically, again, before we talked about how it was like, well, single family zoning is a boon to your health. Well, this is like, hey, this is democracy. This is as American as it gets. You have a right to say whether or not you want this public housing in your neighborhood, right? And so that's how that started. So I looked into what kind of public housing we have in Los Angeles. And so these are a couple of examples. This is Ramona Gardens in Boyle Heights. It's described as having 498 townhomes. So how is this managed? Well, the Housing Services Department administers the public housing program and oversees the management of 14 large HACLA-owned public housing developments consisting of like over 6,300 units located throughout the city of Los Angeles. So the public housing program receives subsidies from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, which you might have heard as HUD or HUD, and they provide affordable housing to over 19,000 low-income families, individuals, senior citizens, and persons with disabilities. So you'll see this is one of them that we have, and this is another one, Jordan Downs and Watts, South Los Angeles. And I couldn't help but notice that of HACLA's 14 public housing locations, that 9 or 10 of the 14 locations are in East and South LA. And earlier I mentioned that Wagner-Steagall Act or Housing Act of 1937, where the federal government provided funding for, but ownership and operation of all that kind of public housing was left to local housing authorities, right? And I think we can see how public housing was primarily built in areas that were mostly red and yellow lined. 10 of these 14 locations, like I said, are in East and South LA. And so what we would like to see is to see more of this sort of thing if we could get the funding for it to be built in other areas like on the coast and on the west side. Another thing that contributed to these segregation of these segregationist sort of housing policies are highway construction and eminent domain. So as our country embraced cars, they felt the need to create highways. And the segregation part of it is that it was often through neighborhoods that were of mixed race, vibrant communities of colors, and they sort of just like raised right through those neighborhoods. And in some cases, even actually advertised the highways as like, again, we talked about these natural favorable restrictions in the form of mountains. Well, highways were used in very much the same way. Like literally, it's like on one side is the wealthy people, and then on the other side is the sort of like urban people, as they might have called them. And they do that with using eminent domain. So the government is allowed to take your property for public improvements. And a lot of the times there's supposed to be compensation or there's a promise of public affordable housing, things like that. And that wasn't always followed up on. And so there's a lot of displacement here, which is a problem, right? That is an issue that we're seeing with gentrification when it's handled badly and things like that. But I think it's important to note that so more than 475,000 households and more than 1 million people were displaced nationwide because of this federal roadway construction. 60-some% of the planned highways in Los Angeles were built, right? So only 60%, but all of the ones that were planned for to go through yellow and red line neighborhoods were built. So there were some that weren't, and that's because the people in those areas had enough influence and probably enough money, if those are one and the same, I don't know, maybe, seems like it. But they were like, no, you're not going to do this here. You're not going to build this here. There's a 710 stub in Pasadena that I believe it still displaced a lot of folks. But I think it was a similar thing where it was like, no, we're not going to build that door, or they just never followed up on it. But that is to say that you can see how, even though it seemed highways were necessary because we were getting more cars and we wanted to be able to travel and things like that, it seemed necessary. It was the impact of it that was really harmful and discriminatory. So earlier I mentioned dog whistle segregation. So what is that? Dog whistle segregation is, if you think about what a dog whistle is, it's a whistle that is at a frequency that only a dog can hear, right? So people might be standing there blowing a whistle and you might look at it and be like, what the heck? If you don't know it's a dog whistle, you're like, that whistle isn't working. You need to do what, right? But the reality of it is that who can hear it or who it affects can hear it. They do see it, they do respond to it. And so dog whistle segregation, earlier I mentioned that there are a lot of policies and things like that that seem neutral, on its surface, and maybe they are in some cases. I do think that there's a lot of explicit racist attitudes and actions that have been taken, but it may be a neutral thing. Regardless, the impact of it is what's discriminatory. And so that's what this dog whistle segregation is that we're talking about, and you'll understand a little bit more. But first, for context, I have to say that in the civil rights era, we had this Fair Housing Act that was finally passed in 1968, but it was one of the most filibustered bills ever. I don't know how long it was exactly. That's how it was described to me, but it was the longest filibustered ever, which means that people were just talking in order to not vote on it, right? If you've seen Parks and Rec, the TV show, there's an episode where Leslie Knope does a filibuster thing and then she really has to pee at the end. Anyway, so you can see how that works, like in media and also in real life. But what was interesting about this is that they finally passed it out of the Senate 1 week after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. So I'm guessing that at that point, it was probably the pressure of the civil rights era and everybody being really upset and angry about that assassination, that they were finally like, okay, fine, we'll pass this out of the Senate and we'll get it into law. And so, yes, this basically just states that you cannot discriminate against anyone on the basis of their race and or other protected classes when it comes to housing and various other things. So that's important because that's where it becomes like, well, since you can't really do it so explicitly, there are still folks that feel that way, feel a certain way around, non-white folks, around non-wealthy folks. And so it's like, okay, well, here are other ways to sort of constrain building, particularly where, but also just in general. And so you'll see that there's a lot of zoning changes, right? So we talked about single family zoning. Well, part of zoning is also dictating what can be built and how, what it could look like as far as like how tall it is, how much space it takes up on a parcel or a lot. And so there were a lot of things that really constricted the kind of building that they could do on a particular parcel. You'll notice in this graph, it shows that in 1960, the way we were zoned for building was much, much different. We could have accommodated 10 million people in 1960, right? So we only had a population of like 2.48 million. So we were only using about 25% of the available space at that time. But with these zoning restrictions, as things started to get zoned more and more and restricted more and more, then suddenly we can't accommodate 10 million people anymore. Now we can only accommodate a little bit less than 4 million. And so now we're using 75% in 1980 of our space, of our available land. Where did it go, right? It's because of the zoning changes. And there's one in particular, like Prop U and some of the parking minimums that were really harmful and really made it difficult to be able to build more low-income housing or just multifamily housing in general. I like to talk about this with dingbats. So that's like LA's, it's quintessentially LA. It's an affordable housing thing. Some people hate the architecture, but the reality of it is that these buildings that have the parking spaces on the ground floor, and then the units are above those. Usually they're adorned with some special name, like a big like logo or something like that. But as the parking minimums increased, it became like useless to try to build these kind of apartments, right? Because they had to work backwards at one point to decide, okay, like, well, how many vehicles could this property accommodate? And so it was vehicles first and people second, right? And then in 1964, and again, that's around the time of the civil rights era, the parking minimums increased to 1.5 spaces per unit, and then it wasn't worth it to build those anymore, which is unfortunate, regardless of how you feel about the architecture. It was unfortunate. We can't build those anymore. More stuff that happened that was sort of dog whistle segregation is urban renewal. So here we go again. The government comes in and they're like, look, we understand that some of you folks have blighted neighborhoods, right? That they need to be improved. There needs to be an investment of money in these neighborhoods. So we'll send you money, and you can change it up. And what you're actually looking at here, this is parts of downtown LA. And so it actually had like mansions, like there were like rich people, some who were non-white, and there was just a lot of multifamily housing too. It was diverse, mixed income. It was diverse neighborhoods, all of that stuff, and they just raised all of that. They flattened the land. They got rid of it all. Here you'll see, I think in the bottom left, the black and white picture. That's like the Civic Center, right? And you see that there's still a couple of mansions there. It looks like I don't know if they're moving those. But yeah, like this was all populated. Let me go back with all of this stuff, all of this density, right? And different kinds of housing, multifamily housing, rich people, lower income folks, and had all of that. And then the city decided, or the county or whoever decided, hey, this is a blighted neighborhood, so we're going to wipe it and build something that's better. And unfortunately, I mean, it's one of the sort of staples of Los Angeles, with its I think connection to Disney and stuff like that. But instead of providing like affordable housing or things like that, they created the music center, right? And this kinds of thing happens a lot all over the country. It's not even the only thing to happen in Los Angeles. The Dodger Stadium was another thing. And I want to add, once I learn a little bit more about the details of that, I'm going to add slides about that. So that's another thing, is that every time you come to a Housing 101, things might be a little bit different. So there's always something new to learn or to look at. But yeah, so but this is the kind of thing that happens, is that those areas are seized, usually from folks. In turn with the Dodger Stadium, the communities that live there were called La Loma. Oh gosh, what was it? Now I'm gonna forget what it was called. There's 3 names, and I'm sorry I can't remember right now, but that's why I'm in the process of learning more. Always learning more. But those communities were ousted and just sort of like kicked out. And then rather than build affordable housing or public housing or whatever it was meant to be, they built Dodger Stadium. And so again, we have these things that are sort of like staples to Los Angeles, right? And like if you think when tourists come, it's like, oh, I got to see the music center. Oh, I got to go to the Dodger Stadium. Oh, I got to do those things. But they kind of have a nasty history. And so that's not to say that you can't love those things. I'm not telling you to not love Los Angeles, but be aware of those kinds of practices and sort of like the effect that it had on the people that used to live there, because they are people, right? It's not. I think that there's a lot of dehumanization in housing, and so I think that we have to remember that these are people, these are families, these are folks that are just trying to live like we are now, and they got kicked out of their homes, were promised stuff, and then it never delivered. Another thing around dog whistle segregation, Ronald Reagan signed the CEQA law into law. So that's the California Environmental Quality Act. And it generally requires state and local government agencies to inform decision makers and the public about the potential environmental impacts of proposed projects and to reduce those environmental impacts to the extent feasible. So first, this was for very large public works projects, but within a few years, it applied to everything built in California. And why is this a problem? Well, it turned out that a lot of the people, like people were, or organizations or groups were using CEQA to stop more housing being built, but not really for great reasons. We have this information that suggests that fewer than 1 in 8 CEQA lawsuits filed by groups had no records of environmental advocacy, or excuse me, I should say only 1 in 8 had records of environmental advocacy. So that's to say that there are a bunch of groups that had never really engaged in environmental advocacy for, that were suddenly like, oh, well, we're going to use CEQA. We're going to use California Environmental Quality Act to either demand an environmental impact report or just outright deny this project. And so 80% of those lawsuits targeted infill housing. What the issue is with these environmental impact reports is that they also will lengthen the amount of time it takes for things to get built, right? Take 2.5 years. Honestly, sometimes that's generous. Sometimes it's much more. And so with that, I mean, that means that we had to build out instead of up, right? So instead of increasing the density, instead of building apartment buildings and things like that that can house more folks in a smaller area, we're building out and into, fire danger areas. And so that kind of seems like antithetical to the California Environmental Quality Act, you would think, right? It's like, okay, well, you're worried about the environment, but you're putting people out where they're going to catch fire and lose all their belongings or possibly lose their life. That's an issue, right? Prop 13. So, Prop 13 is another one of those things where it's like, what? If you're a homeowner, it's great, right? Because it locks in your property taxes as a homeowner. So it makes it so that way it'll only go up, like I think, 1% maximum per year. And prior to that, tax rates were assessed and modified to determine what the needs were for the city. And so it was sort of like, okay, well, the city needs these kinds of improvements or needs these services here or what have you. And so we'll adjust, property taxes a little bit to accommodate that. And unfortunately, when property taxes got limited and sort of halted, then it's not the only source, but one of the things that they turned to be able to get that sort of funding for different kinds of services and the city's needs and things was sales tax. And maybe we can have a discussion about this, but I think that wealthy people typically are the ones that are homeowners, and sales tax may or may not, probably not, have a huge impact on them, right? Because they have generally just sort of more money to use. And sort of other folks, renters, we sort of deal with sales tax the most, and it has the most impact. Now, sales tax is not the only source for these funds, and I want to stress that. But you think about that, right? It's like, okay, well, if property taxes can't go up, and most of the people who pay property taxes are wealthy homeowners, and then it falls to sales tax, that's sort of an issue, right? You'll see that there also, where there's more constraint and more sort of like work on being able to provide money to the city placed on people who may not already have trouble with money, or have low income jobs or things like that. And finally, for this section, I think it's finally, maybe it's not. We have housing elements. And so since 1969, California has required that all local governments, cities and counties adequately plan to meet the housing needs of everyone in the community. California's local governments meet this requirement by adopting housing plans as a part of their general plan. And so there will often be an inventory of all the housing that's in stock. And it's basically because of there is a regional housing needs allocation, which you can learn more about in a couple of the courses that we have, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But basically there is an agency that determines how much more housing we need to build and what cities are going to build it. What is their part of it, right? Because the idea is that everyone collaborates to create enough housing for everybody. So the regional housing needs assessment is is implemented, and then they come through with the regional housing needs allocation, and that basically says, hey, Los Angeles, you have to build, 70,000 units or something like that. But a lot of the times the housing element has been misused. Sometimes they report bogus stuff. Sometimes they plan for housing but just don't build it, or they plan for housing in areas that maybe it can't be built, like the median of a street, or like things like that. And so that's an issue. But they're like, hey, we're going to build it, but their plans, they either don't follow up or it's just not possible. And then another thing is that we hear these stories about some city, and I can't find which city it was, unfortunately, but I am on a mission to find this. But they counted prison beds and student dorms as low-income housing, and that was mentioned in this LA Times article from 2017. But like, that's messed up. Like, what kind of pipeline is that to suggest that prison beds and student dorms are low-income housing? Like, that's ridiculous. So why does all this suck? I mean, there's obvious reasons, right? Like, discrimination is never good, and racism is never good, right? But let's look at the data here. So let's talk about why segregation sucks. So we have terrible rates of construction. When I was looking for these, I was like, oh, okay, look, we have on the left, we have this the places, the metro areas that are building housing at the fastest pace. And I was like, oh, where's Los Angeles? Where are we on this list? And it didn't find it, right? We're like, oh, we're not on that one. Come to find out, we're actually on the one on the right that has housing at the slowest pace. And I was like, oh, okay, that's not great. So why is that a problem, right? So with all these restrictions, with all these zoning restrictions, with all of these, you can't build high, you can't build in these areas. This is specifically zoned for single family detached homes. These areas can't be built for more than like 3 stories or things like that. A lot of these things have really slowed the production of housing. And so why is that an issue? Well, there's an issue because it's a supply and demand thing. Population continues to grow, and that might be naturally, that might be because people are having kids, that might be because some people move to California, but ultimately a lot of our people that are homeless in California are actually residents of California. And so when we cannot continue to build to accommodate the population, the costs go up, right? Because it's all, think about like if you want this really special toy that, I don't know, Burger King had in like the 90s or whatever, and you can't find it anywhere, but you find one on eBay or something. But because it's rare and it's old and it's the only one, someone's charging like, $50,000 for it or something, right? Think about that in terms of housing. If we're not building more housing, but the population is growing, then we're having a supply and demand issue. We're having a lot of demand and not enough supply to meet that demand. And so then it becomes sort of competitive. The costs go up. And then it's like, oh, if there's one that goes up that I can actually afford, I better jump in there, right? Or there's other people that are making better offers, or the people that are selling want a lot more because they don't have that many units, or they can't produce or manage more units because those are not being built. And so what you'll see here in this graph is that the housing cost, ideally we want our rent to be 30% of our income, right? Between 20 and like 40% is like the sort of ideal range, right? And so we want 30%. And what we're seeing here on this graph is that Los Angeles has one of the highest housing costs as far as percentage of income. And it's up there above 55%. So that means people are on average spending more than half their income on rent. And that's an issue. And you'll see that that happens where there is more housing scarcity, when there's less housing supply. And then what happens there? Well, like I said earlier, people who are experiencing homelessness, the main cause is that housing is unaffordable because the costs have gone up because we're not building enough. And people like to say, oh, well, you become homeless because, you're using substances, or you have mental illness issues, or things like that. And that's just not true. Like, I'm sure that there are some folks that happens. But I also am of the belief that folks that are experiencing homelessness really don't get into substance use or have mental health issues until they are experiencing homelessness, because there's this like fundamental lack of safety, right? Lack of security in not having a home, not having a roof over your head. It's unaffordability. I mentioned earlier that as a kid, my mom and I got a few eviction notices, that just shows that, like, if you're not making enough money, which, I think that there's a very select group of people that are making enough money to pay $4,000 or whatever for an apartment or a studio or whatever's in Los Angeles. But if you're not making enough, like, one financial emergency can get you evicted, if because maybe you can't afford rent or something. And so that's an issue. That's the main cause of homelessness, is housing unaffordability and the high cost burden that comes with it. Wealth disparities. This is based on redlining. So what you'll see here is that that segregation, you'll see that the earnings and the median household income are often lower for folks that live in areas that were previously red and yellow lined. And so that's data that's just been caught. It's not like a study or anything like that, not manipulated. Like, that's just observational data. It's empirical evidence. And so that is something to show that, housing is also related to wealth and other disparities that people experience, including health. So there's a higher prevalence of COVID-19 risk factors in historically redlined neighborhoods. And I found this interesting website that actually links particular areas currently, right, that are current, that have this social vulnerability. And so what that is that these folks who run the site created this social vulnerability index. And it's made up of a lot of different characteristics of folks. So it's like whether you're a minority, experiencing poverty, you have asthma or diabetes, high blood pressure, kidney disease, you're experiencing obesity, or you have some sort of pulmonary disease. These things create your social vulnerability index. And it lines up to say that the people that have a greater vulnerability and have more chance and prevalence of catching COVID-19, but also being severely impacted by it health-wise, are folks that live in areas that are previously red or yellow lined. And I will say that earlier I said I live in the Pico Union neighborhood. My neighborhood was called out in LA Times for being overcrowded, and particularly around the pandemic. And it's true. Like, actually, during the pandemic, our mail person stopped delivering mail the way they did because they didn't want to come into our little courtyard, which, our front doors are, I don't know, I don't do measurement, I don't do feet, I don't do any of that stuff. I'm not good at that, but it's relatively close. So we're living in close proximity to one another. And so the mail people were like, we don't feel like that's safe. So we had to move all of our mailboxes to the front of our courtyard. And so I think that that's really important to notice and to mention and to consider, is that a lot of these things are not just about, like, it's not random. It's not just some sort of passing issue. We're seeing how housing policy has segregated folks, is discriminatory, and there are effects, there are negative impacts of those things. And that can extend beyond just, well, I want to live somewhere new, and also, but it goes to, the health. Actually, I think there's the number one single determinant of your life expectancy is where you live. And again, we talked about some of these health issues. You'll also find that air quality data has been analyzed, and because of institutional racism leading to landfills, incinerators, and hazardous waste disposal being disproportionately placed in communities of color, you'll see that the air quality is also worse in areas that were previously redlined or yellow lined. So, solutions. what do we do, right? Because there's so much, and that's not even all of it, honestly. There's so much, and we could get into details about all of the things that I've mentioned already, right? Like there's so much to learn and to go through. So, but what are some solutions? Well, density bonuses, and I'm talking about stuff that exists already and that we'd like to see more of and continue to support. But the density bonus is a state mandate. A developer who meets the requirements of the state law is entitled to receive the density bonus and other benefits as a matter of right. So as with any state mandate, some local governments will resist complying with the state requirement, but many favor the density bonus as a helpful tool to cut through their own land use requirements and local political issues. So the use of a density bonus may be particularly helpful and are particularly helpful in jurisdictions that impose inclusionary housing requirements on new development. So that's to say that like you might hear projects that are being built on the west side, like in Santa Monica or other places like that. And that is they often will use density bonuses there. And so this is what that looks like. That is to say that new developments can build more units despite any zoning restrictions and ensure that some of the units will be affordable. And that is specifically available to these different tiers of affordable, right? Which is moderate, low, and lower income residents. And then you can also offer there's some options for students, senior citizens, transitional foster youth, disabled veterans, and people experiencing homelessness. But this is an inclusionary housing policy. And we have to make sure that more affordable units are being built across Los Angeles and California, and not just in those specific communities, particularly the ones that have experienced disinvestment, like East and South LA, right? We don't want to just continue to build affordable housing units there. We should be building it in other places as well. One such thing that passed that has been helpful, that made use of density bonuses, was LA Measure JJJ. It was passed in 2016. And it's important to mention that this is particularly for, and especially for, LA City. It's not for the other 87 cities in Los Angeles County. It is an LA City measure, but it applied the same general points of that California state density bonus law. And so there are other parts of this measure, for example, having to do with labor, making sure that there are prevailing wages, people are being hired locally instead of bringing in people from other places, and also making sure that they're having fair working conditions. So this was a big boon for us, both for labor, which you'll find sometimes housing issues are indeed labor issues, but construction and materials and things like that, they have a cost, and so a lot of the times you'll find that labor and housing are often mingling. And so, but this was a good thing, right? So in general, here are some more things that we want to be able to do as solutions. We want to allow multifamily homes in all commercially zoned areas, near job centers, near transit, especially in high income areas. We want to build housing away from wildfire danger areas. And we want to end exclusionary single family zoning. We want to make the most residential and mixed use developments by right. So that is to say that there's not going to be this whole thing of like, oh, should we, can we, it's just going to be like, no, we're going to build it, right? That's what by right means. Take action. We want to take action on climate change by reforming the California Environmental Quality Act. And we want to improve public outreach methods for decision-making on housing, because also we find that the input that we're getting is not diverse, right? There's a lot of folks that I feel like are not given the sort of political power, and whether that's because they don't know about it or they don't feel like they'll make a difference. We find that a lot of the people that make the decisions are the ones that are rich folks, probably white, and we need more than that. We need more than that because California, Los Angeles is diverse, and there are a lot of different people who live here, and it's not fair and it's not equitable to have only certain people being able to give their opinions and be able to be part of the decision-making process. So just to round this out, we want to legalize more homes and we want to make homes easier to build. We also want to limit evictions to just cause scenarios like non-payment of rent or property destruction. We want to track and prosecute slumlords who repeatedly violate housing codes and tenant rights. We want to provide legal counsel to all renters. Los Angeles County has a deficit of over 700,000 homes that are affordable to households with low income, a situation that accelerates neighborhood displacement and pushes Angelinos into homelessness. And so we want to reform Proposition 13 and tax property owners fairly. We want to introduce a progressive tax on property sales. And we want to make rent subsidies available to all lower income households. So just to round that out, we want to strengthen renters' rights and we want to fund affordable housing. These 4 points are Abundant Housing LA's policy agenda, and we do all of these with on the foundation of promoting racial justice and equity. So, what is your call to action? Well, great. I learned about all of this horrible history of housing. I learned about what some of the solutions are. What can I do? Right. Well, first of all, you're here. This is a great start. We called this the intro to advocacy, to housing advocacy, because we have to know where we've been to decide where we're going, right? And so this is how we ended up here. This is why we're in a housing crisis and a housing shortage, is because people have been excluded from some areas and building has been restrained, right? So the next Housing 101 is going to be next month. It's going to be Saturday, October 14th. Come back to see if there's any new information, which there probably will be, but also tell your friends to come. If you know anybody who's also a housing nerd or is maybe unfortunately dealing with some housing instability or scarcity and they want to do something about it, this is a great place to come and learn about that and figure out sort of what works for you as far as your interests and what you want to do as an advocate. Also follow us on our socials. We're on Instagram, we're on Threads, we're on Twitter or X now, we're on Facebook and we're on TikTok. Also think about joining a chapter. So we have chapters all over Los Angeles. We do some grassroots organizing. And so what we'll do is we'll have, often the chapters will support developments, we'll attend city council or planning commission meetings, things like that to give public comment. And so those are really exciting to be able to be a part of. And often it's very effective because sometimes we show up with several people and, you know, really, I think what we've talked about before is that a lot of the time, the loudest voices in the rooms are the people who are opposing more housing, right? And so we don't want that. We want to counter that. And sometimes those folks don't show up to all of these meetings though. So if us pro-housing folks show up with our chapter, with a few other Abundant Housing LA folks or other advocates, and say, hey, we need this to happen, or we need this to get built or whatever, it actually goes a long way. So that's some of the stuff that we do. You want to join Abundant Housing LA also because we do social stuff. We do a lot of things. And so, it's fun, but it's also very impactful and effective. And I think it's going to be better for our city. So think about joining Abundant Housing LA, one of our chapters. Another thing is that we do have what's called the Housing Advocates Council. And so that is a bit of a membership. It's like an unofficial volunteer board of directors. So they help us with a lot of our strategic stuff. We have a lot of committees within the Housing Advocates Council. There's an education committee that I lead. We have a racial justice and equity committee, which I also lead. We have an endorsement committee. We have a strategy committee. We have lots of that stuff. And so you can get into really something that super interests you around housing into those committees, or you can just stay a general member of Housing Advocates Council and you'll still be able to get involved with our strategy and stuff like that. If you're interested in that, I have links here and we can share those in the chat, or we can send them out in an email to you folks afterward. But our staff member Omar Gonzalez actually manages a lot of our Housing Advocates Council stuff. He's our Director of Engagement and Leadership Development. So he's someone you can reach out to if you're interested in finding out more about our Housing Advocates Council. These are the events. We have events every month. This one we're having this month on Wednesday, September 20th. We're actually bringing in someone who is the CEO of a company called Housing for Us All. They operate outside of Los Angeles County, and they do things a little bit different. And I'll just say that they find it easier to do what they do outside of Los Angeles County because they don't suffer the same sort of governance complications that we experience in Los Angeles, right? There's so many different steps to a process of getting something approved. So yeah, come to learn about that. That's actually going to be at our office in downtown on Wednesday the 20th at 6:30 p.m. Easily accessible by a major metro station. So we hope that we'll see you there. And also, I think this is the last thing I have. We have actually a pro housing. We have a couple of pro housing courses that we're doing. So we have a 12-week course that's the pro housing leadership certification course. We cover 3 different modules: development and land use, equity and policy, and architecture. We bring in experts and academics to teach us about various housing related things, and really just gives you an idea of how housing gets built, maybe what you could do to advocate for more. For some folks, it's been great to start their own nonprofits. For some folks, it's been a great sort of career boost, right? And so that would be that's really interesting. We've started, we've done 2 sessions already, but they are recorded, they're live. And so you'll be able to still watch and engage with the content, even if you've missed a live session. It's all available. So reach out to us if you're interested in that. And then also, we're starting something new. In October, we're starting a little bit shorter, more focused course about below market rate housing, which is sort of the term that I think we're trying to get into using instead of affordable housing, because there's a difference between capital A and lowercase a, and there's a lot of confusing stuff there, but it is an affordable housing course. And we'll be covering housing elements, CEQA, ADUs, and a lot more. Both of these things, they do have a cost, but we have scholarships available and we do generous discounts. So I hope that if anyone's interest is piqued by one of these, that you'll contact me at joshua@abundanthousingle.org and ask me about the discounts and stuff, because what's most important to us is that we just want to get people in to be able to learn more, so that way we continue to build this movement to building more housing, right? So yeah, let us know if you're interested. I hope you are, because they're actually really great sessions. They're really great courses. There's a lot of great information. And also there's a cool, swanky end of year party that we have in December, and all of our pro housing course folks are invited to that, as well as our Housing Advocates Council members. So get in on some of that fun stuff too by joining. So that's kind of it for me. And Lauren has a question. Perfect. Lauren, what do you got? Let me see. I'm not sure if you can like unmute. Let me see if I can change that. Yeah. Okay, there we go. What do you got, Lauren?
That was great. Thanks. And if anybody needs an endorsement, I'm taking the 12th course, and so far it is fascinating and getting a lot of information. So that's my endorsement. I do want to point out to everybody, in case they missed in the blizzard of links that I sent, we've got 2 things that are going to be on the ballot this year that passed through the legislature, and these will be constitutional amendments. The most important one is to repeal Section 4, which is to get the state back into building affordable, always affordable housing. And the second one, which I find fascinating, would enshrine housing as a human right in our state constitution. So our ballot will be crowded, but if everybody could keep an eye out for those and tell your friends, we really need to make a constitutional stand on that. So that's my PSA.
Thank you, and thank you for your endorsement of the course too. I'm looking over the chat now, sort of going backwards. I see that Megan asked, when does the 12-week course start? So it actually started this past week. Like I said, we've already done 2 sessions, but the live sessions are recorded. and we upload those in addition to slide decks and any other materials that the instructors provided. So you can engage with the content at your own pace. And so enrollment doesn't stop. It's always happening. So Megan, if you're interested, please reach out to me. Let me put my email address in here, Abundant Housing LA. All right. So yeah, reach out if you're interested. Don't feel like you've missed anything, because like I said, it's all still there. We did that on purpose because we know that not everyone would be able to, or we wouldn't reach everybody to be able to enroll right at the outset of the course. So yes, please reach out about that. And I'm just looking through. Thank you, Lauren, for putting all your plugs in the chat. Andrew says, not sure I'm in agreement. Measure JJJ halted development for many years. Few projects have filed for entitlements under the Measure JJJ rules, and only one project has been approved to date, from my understanding. Thank you for that, Andrew. That's good to know. Yeah, I think, again, it's funny because we talked about sort of like how a lot of housing policy sometimes is neutral, and it's the way that it falls that is, is harmful, or, has a negative impact. And I think that also falls with the stuff that's good, right? There's stuff that's good and maybe has great intentions, but for whatever reason, sometimes they don't work as smoothly or as effectively as we hope. That said, I do think that, more density bonus stuff and more incentives to build more housing is good. We just have to, sort of create a little bit of a streamlined pathway for that sort of thing. Let's see. Sam says it's interesting that basically nowhere is affordable on average at 30%. Yeah, that's true. And again, that's a housing scarcity issue that we're having. I think it would be different if we were building enough housing and keeping pace with the population growth. Let's see. And if there's anything in particular that I am like sort of passing over that someone wants me to mention or talk about, please let me know. Let's see. I see that, Lauren, when will today's slide deck be uploaded to Teach? So this one doesn't get uploaded to Teachable, the Housing 101. However, we do follow up with all the folks that RSVP'd and attended. And so when we do that, we will send a link to this slide deck. So that's something that you all will get as well. Let's see. I see stuff about bills. Let's see. The Music Center was a county project pushed by the fabulously wealthy Chandler family, publishers of the LA Times. Okay, that's good to know. Courtney says, I second that about dehumanization of housing discussion topics. Yep. Let's see. Oh, did I say, yeah, that was Bunker Hill. I think that must have been when I was talking about like urban renewal. That Lauren mentioned Bunker Hill around that time. Andrew said, I love dingbats, great for ADU conversions. Yeah, yay, dingbats. Let's see. And I see that, Lauren, you've been sharing a lot of stuff, so thank you so much for being active in the chat. The DMV size is a real thing. Yes, it is. That is so true. Okay, that was the chat. Again, if there's anything that you specifically would like addressed, please let me know. But I'm going to go to the Q&A here. So let's see. So we did talk about where the questions would be. What's been TOC's impact on affordable housing? That is to say, beyond the tech bros who can pay market rate. That's a good question that I'm not sure I have the answer to. I think that TOC in general has a decent impact, but just as sort of like Andrew brought up in the chat, like Measure JJJ sounds good, but it hasn't been so effective as of late, or really at all. I don't know about TOC. I think that's something I need to do a little bit more research on to see sort of like, and for folks that don't know, TOC is transit-oriented communities. You might also hear TOD, which is transit-oriented development, but it's basically to say that new housing needs to be built near transit, right? And so there are a lot of like policies and things like that will bring TOC in, and it's a good thing. It's what we want. There are things like AB 2097 that passed, was it last year or the year before? Time goes by so quickly. But that was basically a parking bill that stated that, within a certain area or distance from a major transit stop, that housing or any sort of, I think it's commercial and residential. If it's built, when it's built, they don't have to include parking, right? So there's nothing that says, yes, you have to include 1.5 spaces or 2 spaces per person or unit or what have you. If you decide not to, you don't have to include any parking there. And so that's sort of a TOC thing. But yeah, I'm not really sure what the impact of that has been at this point. Let's see. Andrew says, thank you. Let's see. What do we got? We got Sam says TOC includes affordable units as part of its density bonus. I think almost all projects in LA are TOC these days. Thank you for that. TOC, and then Andrew adds, TOC has been successful adding affordable units subsidized by the additional market rate units, as well as allowing changes in development standards, which would render the project infeasible. Okay, let's see. Okay, and Eric just said tenants' rights group called ACE has been working to pass SB 567. If anyone is interested in tapping in with them, there's a link in the chat. Let me make sure I'm not missing any other questions or anything. Okay. Yeah, I don't see any other questions right now, but please take your time if you're, coming up with stuff or adding things that we want to talk about. Please feel free. I'm not going to kick everyone out just yet. So, Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah, I can't remember offhand, but what is the percentage of affordable units? If I'm remembering correctly, it's something like there are several tiers. Let's say it's 10%, but those were for very low income as opposed to affordable for civil service workers. Do you recall?
Let me see. I think I have that on the slide, actually. Let me go back.
But it's not creating affordable housing per se.
Let's see.
It's overwhelmingly market rate.
Oh, wait, there we go. Yeah, I think that was mentioned here. Oh, so Andrew put it in the chat too. But yeah, I think it's like at least these are the at least ones. But let's look at what Andrew put on. Andrew works in ADU stuff, if that's okay to mention, Andrew. But yeah, he says tier 1, 8% of the total number of dwelling units shall be affordable to extremely low income households, or 11% of the total number of dwelling units shall be affordable to very low income households, or 20% of total number dwelling units shall be affordable. So it's all of these sort of like options, right? But yeah, those are the percentages in the chat. If anyone wants to take a look at that. And I think what I'll do is for everyone, when I send the link, when we do follow-ups, we'll also include the chat, so that way people can look at those, make sure that there's important information that people get if they need it. All right, so we're winding down. We finished a little bit early. As I get more comfortable with this and refine this presentation, it becomes a little more effective and things like that. So yeah, if there's any other questions, like now's the time. If you have any thoughts, comments, feedback of any kind for this, like please feel free. You can raise your hand and I'll allow you to unmute, just like Laura did. If you want to put anything in the chat or the Q&A, please feel free. Yeah, no problem, Lauren. Thank you so much. And thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Eric. Everybody who's been really active. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you. Courtney is one of our field organizers, by the way. So Courtney, thank you so much for being here. If she's still here. Oh, she's not here anymore. Okay, just kidding. Yeah, of course. Thank you, Sam. Andrew says, most affordable housing will be created by Mayor Bass's ED1, which streamlines the approval timelines to 4 to 6 months, which were typically 1 to 2 years. Okay, that's fantastic. Lauren, info for chapter memberships. So are you just talking about like getting connected with someone, or are you talking about like what chapters exist?
Well, I think since we don't all live in the same neighborhood,
Yeah.
if we could go to a link and then look it up for ourselves, that might be helpful.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's possible.
let me see, because I think we do have a little bit. I think usually what we do is I don't think we have a list somewhere, which is something we're working on, by the way. But let me look at this. Yes, here we go. Join your local chapter. Aha. So this doesn't necessarily like connect you, like there's not links, but if you go there, that is a kind of list of our chapters. If you go to that web, so if you go to abundanthousinglA.org/chapters, you will see a little bit of a list. I'm trying to make sure we do have Trojans for More Housing on there. So there's a couple newer ones that aren't on there. Or like I said, Courtney Miles was here, and she's one of our field organizers, and she's her area is actually in South LA. So we have another one called South Bay Forward. We're working in sort of the Watts and the Willowbrooks area as well. So there are a couple that aren't on here, but these are our most well-known and established ones on that list. So if you're interested in getting involved, there's also a link there to email our director of organizing, Jaime Del Rio, and he can connect you to those chapters, tell you when the meetings are, and all of that good stuff. Thank you, Andrew. Okay, let's see what else we got. Pasadena, Richard. Yeah. Oh yeah. Andrew is in the Pasadena chapter. I'm sorry for not remembering that. It's hard to remember who's where. Cool. All right. All right. Well, I got nothing left for you today. For those that are still here. But thank you so much for coming, for being active, for just wanting to know more about housing. I don't have a housing background. I am a social worker and a therapist, and found my way to housing. And so there's still a lot that I need to learn, a lot of gaps of knowledge to fill. But I just say that because I like the community that's created when we have these meetings. When there's stuff that I don't know, there's stuff that someone else does, and we can all learn together and get on the same page. So I love that. All right, have a great one, everybody. Please enjoy your weekend. A lot of joy to you all, and till next time. This has been Abundant Housing LA's Housing 101 webinar. Bye. It's true. Eric said, together we know a lot. I said bye, but I wanted to add that. Together we know a lot. It is true. All right. Bye, everybody.